So I think we are about to start. Ladies and gentlemen, and everybody who's watching us by the screens from your homes or offices, welcome to the first in a line of our online talks, this one called NATO Summit Outcomes. I have a really great pleasure to have a great, lineup of speakers today with us, good friends of the Atlantic Council, good friends of Montenegro and of NATO in particular, who will discuss with us, the NATO Summit Outcomes and the future of NATO briefly, in a next hour or hour and a half maximum, to see, and to try to find out, in which direction NATO should go and what we can expect in the upcoming period. Therefore, allow me to introduce, our today's speakers. The first in a line, Ms. Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, former president of Croatia and also Assistant Secretary General to NATO for many years, somebody who knows the situation in NATO, but in the region very well. So she will be definitely able to speak and to give her insight into the topic. So Kolinda, welcome and thank you for joining us. Then also, Benjamin Haddad, Director of the European Center for the Atlantic Council of the United States, our partnership organization, our friend, somebody who knows and who's doing, as we discussed before, on strengthening the transatlantic bond and trying to find the best possible ways, how to move forward with all what we have right now on a scene, and not only in respect to NATO, but in respect to a number of other things. Then also one of our good friends, Stefano Stefanini, who just disappeared from the screen. So Stefano, where are you? How are you? Nice to see you. And thank you for joining us. Used to be a permanent representative of Italy to NATO. Definitely a guy who knows things in NATO, how NATO is functioning, and who will have a very good insight in that. And last but not least, Vice President of the Atlantic Council, a friend of the Atlantic Council for so many years before he joined the Atlantic Council, Mr. Ranko Krivokapić, who used to be the Speaker of the Parliament of Montenegro for many, many years. And also, one of the most important positions, the President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. So Ranko, thank you for joining us and looking forward to hear your insights. So before we start, the topic, as I mentioned, is NATO Summit Outcomes. The signs of reaffirmed transatlantic bond is visible in a simple fact that the summit communiqué in a 79 paragraphs long, comparing to the 9-paragraph long declaration from 2019 summit that employed all its diplomatic language and capacities not to provoke then President Trump. Communiqué tackled new themes and challenges such as China and the climate change. President Biden reaffirmed US support for Article 5, including explicit call-outs in the communiqué of its applicability to hybrid, cyber, and space threats. There was also a try to deprioritize the burden sharing of spending at least 2% of the GDP on defense. Frictions between allies on Ukraine and Afghanistan, one of very important topics as well. Then NATO's Ukraine policy remains unchanged. US military withdrawal from Afghanistan by September 21. NATO members agreed on several concrete steps forward. For the very first time, NATO communiqué takes on China, declaring that Beijing possesses systemic challenges to the rule-based international order and to areas relevant to alliance security. But further than that, it is very hard to understand what the Allies' consensus on China is. The document also leaves out the important challenges such as 5G networks built by the Chinese telecom company Huawei, China's cyber espionage, and Beijing's unfair trade practices, as well as the impact of a conflict in the Indo-Pacific involving the United States. At the end, NATO leaders agreed to develop the next strategic concept in time for the next summit in 2022. So these are just, some basic lines, from the summit recently had. So let's start, if you agree, with the only lady on the panel, Kolinda. As a former president of Croatia, as somebody, who used to be the Assistant Secretary General of NATO, who knows NATO from inside, how NATO and allies actually can confront the illiberal tide which exists right now. And maybe before answering to that particular question, maybe, a short, like up to 5 minutes overview of your views on the situation in general. Thank you. Please.
Thank you, Salva, and good afternoon to you all. Good morning to some of you across the Atlantic. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for your invitation. You've actually posed two rather different questions right now in terms of the overall overview of the situation and a more particular subject on some of the detrimental movements that we see around the world and in the neighborhood of Southeast Europe or the Western Balkans, including these trends towards a rising nationalism, xenophobia, and other trends. Now, certainly when you look back at the last strategic concept, NATO strategic concept from Lisbon from 2010, you see that there have been some major geopolitical shifts and major changes in the regional and international security environment. We have seen re-emergence of rivalries and geopolitical competition. The diplomatic, political, or even military struggle for geographic space, for influence, and for power. That, in my opinion, goes well beyond the old spheres of influence concept. The globalized world is interconnected by those challenges and opportunities, and it has become one big sphere where powers compete for influence and control through various means. And in terms of these geopolitical shifts from a world that was, and a NATO that was relatively static during the time of the Cold War, we have shifted towards the unknown through an era that was dominated by the US power into today's world that I would say is marked by this quadrangle of power between the US, the European Union, Russia, and China, and of course the emerging powers such as BRICS, but many others as well. We have seen the reemergence of traditional territorial threats that we were hoping we would never again see in Europe in terms of military action, occupation, etc. New technologies are changing, both connective and disruptive technologies are changing not just the nature that we communicate and do business today, but they're changing the nature of warfare. They enable new forms of attack, from cyber warfare to sophisticated new weapons based on artificial intelligence to hybrid action and warfare. And in this rapidly developing communications environment, which opens the space for not just information and democratization of the information space, but also for disinformation, malicious intent, undermining of values, institutions, and societies, and meddling into elections and the internal situation in certain countries, Certainly, what happens is a rapid erosion of values, institutions, and societies. We see the spread of radicalism from national to ethnic-based to ideological. And we've seen disruptors such as the pandemics, which within a little bit more than a year has acted both as a catalyst of the processes that had been in the making for decades, and on the other hand has disrupted not just our economies, but our way of life as well. We've seen also threats that are internal to the alliance, and I've witnessed to some of those during NATO Summit. You mentioned the previous administration of the previous president. There were moments where I really wondered how NATO was going to hold together and what we're going to do in order to not just project unity in this divisive world, but really keep the unity. So it's really high time to go ahead with a new strategic concept that is adapted to these changes in the security environment, keeping in mind that NATO is not just a military but a political alliance and alliance of values as well. And this is where your second question comes in: how do we keep the value of democracy, human rights, liberty, etc. going? So a simple answer is we really need to adopt a genuinely strategic mindset that goes well beyond crisis management. So we can't just rely on the three core pillars as defined in the previous concept, but we need to be a lot more responsive. And including in those responses is reacting to what happens on the ground. People today across the world tend to focus on parts of Eastern Europe, on the Baltics, on Ukraine, Georgia, etc. But also in our neighborhood, we have seen interference from third parties who are not necessarily always benevolent or well-intentioned, and who want to disrupt, in a way, the choice of the people to become part of the EU and or NATO for those who choose to do so. And NATO really, alongside with the European Union, has to respond to these threats and has to send very clear messages that go well beyond the open door policy to all people in Southeast Europe and the Western Balkans, that they are on the path of membership, and that the ultimate goal remains their own choice, that it will in a way be rewarded by it, both on the domestic and international scene. And that a strategy that really will keep the hearts and the minds of people on board. I suppose that we're going to discuss the influences in the Western Balkans and the sentiments of people a little bit later, so I don't want to monopolize the podium and go on. I'd like to stop here and give others a chance to comment on these overall trends, and I'm looking forward to continuing the discussion on our particular region as well.
Thank you so much for this introductory remarks, and let's go back to DC. And, the new, not anymore new, but the administration in the House brought some kind of, I would say, a relief for the European allies after 4 years of tiptoeing and quite strange relations between the partners, However, those 4 years did not pass unmarked, and with some burden between the US and the European partners. Drawing from the experience of the Trump era, you realize that it has to strengthen its own capacities. In your opinion, how does Europe perceive America's comeback, and what might be done for Europe to be a more equal partner to the United States? And also, in addition to this, your introductory remarks will be more than welcome. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Savo, and thanks for having me. I'm really delighted to participate to this conversation. You're completely right. I mean, let me maybe first start with the good news. Clearly, we have a Biden administration that is committed to transatlanticism and more generally to US engagement with allies. And we're speaking, of course, just a few days, about 10 days after President Biden's first international visit, which was to Europe. We saw a flurry of international summits, G7, the NATO summit, the first US-EU summit in 7 years before the meeting with President Vladimir Putin, and probably will say a word of this. And I think clearly, we've seen a new commitment from the United States to multilateralism with an ambitious G7 communique, to the relationship with the European Union. Secretary Blinken was in Europe these last few days and made the case for a strong Europe as a partner to the United States. And we already said a word about this, of course, to NATO, to Article 5 and collective defense. And that was really a key message from the Biden administration. I think, there's a desire from this administration to, of course, turn the page of the Trump years. And this is why some of the messaging on NATO or on the EU is also so politically symbolic. And, we'll talk about the content and the substance, but for these international summits, the images, the atmospherics actually do matter. It's a lot about also creating positive momentum, rebuilding personal trust among leaders. And so I think in this respect, it was a successful visit. But a lot of it is also just about the president's vision for the challenges that face the United States today. And a lot of it is clearly about making the case both on the world stage, but also, I would say actually primarily to the US public, that democracies can deliver, that in this ideological struggle between, on the one hand, liberal democracies in Europe, Asia, and the United States, and autocratic systems, first and foremost, of course, Russia, and the more assertive China, that democracies can win the day and they can deliver for their citizens. And this is why we've seen the development with, people like National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, developments of really a more interconnected vision between domestic politics and foreign policy. Something that the administration insists a lot on is the idea that it's conducting a foreign policy for the middle class of the United States. So making sure that US engagement on the world stage with military intervention or a free trade agreement actually trickle down to US population and really deliver concrete results for the US population. I think that's something that, was clearly a priority for the US elite during the Cold War, after the Second World War, and that connection broke a bit since the 90s. And I think that's we've seen the lessons of 2016, of Brexit, of the Trump election. That's not lost on this Biden administration. So I think that's a major priority. And in a symmetric way, that US investment in infrastructure, in innovation, in R&D, in its youth is also a foreign policy asset, especially in the rivalry with China. And so this is why we've seen this administration also very much focused on domestic policy in the last few months, with first with the successful vaccination rollout, the COVID economic recovery bills, the infrastructure bill that's being negotiated and signed right now. All of these, very ambitious economic plans that are not only domestic, but are really seen as foreign policy tools of competition. It's interesting anecdotally, for example, to hear, Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg or President Biden constantly refer to China to justify the infrastructure plan, to justify investing in green technologies or in high-speed trains. So, we have a more internationalist administration, and in a way, as I said, even when it's focusing on domestic politics, there's always an international component to it. These two dimensions are very connected. Now, with that being said, that was a long introduction, though, to come back to your point in the question. I completely agree with you. I think that first, Europeans have not forgotten the last 4 years, and every opinion poll in Europe conducted, by organizations like ECFR and others show that there's still a lot of work to be done to rebuild trust, which is normal, to be fair. I mean, you can't expect these things to go overnight. First, because, the Republican Party is still clearly influenced by this sort of America First vision that's been the centerpiece of the Trump administration. But also, and I would say more importantly, because a lot of the irritants that we've seen in the transatlantic relationship in the last 4 years predated Donald Trump. I think he was largely sort of an accelerator of pre-existing trends, and that some of the debates and some of the questions that his administration asked first were sometimes legitimate, and I think we will see them again in the Biden administration. Let me give a few examples. You mentioned burden sharing, and I think that's a core one. Of course, there will be an expectation from this administration that Europeans step up, that they take more responsibilities for their own defense and security. I think we've spent too much time in the last few years focusing on sort of artificial metrics like the 2% defense spending, and we should focus more on missions. What do we, missions and capabilities, what do we expect each other to do, and where, in which regions, on which capacities should Europeans step up? There's little appetite right now on both the left and the right in the United States for more military interventionism. I mean, one of the first key decisions of the Biden administration was to implement or to announce the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so if you look at especially the European neighborhood, I think it's clearly now an opportunity for Europeans to take on more responsibility, not do it against the United States, not do it, as in rivalry, but do it in allied coordination. And I think here, both NATO and the defense and security tools developed by the European Union in recent years can be effective instruments. Another issue that we'll see, of course, is this administration's focus on China and on the strategic rivalry with China. I already said a word of it, and it was a victory, a success for this administration to see China so much reflected in the different communiques, G7, NATO, and EU as a systemic rival, systemic competitor. I think there will be a lot of appetite from this administration to engage the EU, because the rivalry with China is not only, not even primarily military, it's really about the rules of the globalization that we want to organize. What are the norms and standards on tech, on trade, on the environment? And in this respect, Brussels, the European Commission, is also going to be a critical partner. So we'll see this administration having sort of a two-track approach with NATO and with the EU, and having the two summits basically at the same time. I think it was quite critical in this respect. The announcement of the Trade and Tech Council between the European Union and the United States is also, I think, one of the key takeaways of the summits, and making sure that despite the differences right now on how platforms are being regulated, on content removal and all these things, on data privacy between the United States and Europe, we're much, much closer than we are with the alternative authoritarian, digital authoritarian model that's being promoted right now by Beijing. So there's a lot to work on, and I think we'll see some continuities, as you mentioned, between the previous administration and this administration. But I think now we have positive momentum and a good opportunity to shape a transatlantic relationship where Europeans can take more autonomy and responsibility, but in coordination and I would say within the transatlantic alliance.
Unmute me. Can somebody unmute me? Am I unmute? Can you hear me now? Yes, you can. Perfect. Thank you, Ben. Thank you for your insights. I don't see Stefano. Stefano, are you with us? Or he just disappeared? Doesn't matter, if he shows up, we will gladly, put him in the air. But let's go now to Ranko. Ranko.
Stefan is here.
Yeah.
I don't see you. Sorry, Stefano.
What?
Stefano,
Invisible.
I don't see you on my screen. I don't know why. I don't hear you.
I can see all and listen to all of you. So
glad that you are actually with us. And sorry.
I'm with you.
So please, your introductory remarks, in respect of the NATO Summit outcome, and after that, we will go with the concrete questions. Please, the floor is yours.
Me? Okay. I think what the NATO communique tells us is that NATO has a clear view of where it wants to go. So in a way that will be defined obviously in the new strategic concept, but the communiqué it deserves to be read and weighted because that gives you a good idea of where the new strategic concept will go. So coincidence that the groundwork was laid by the NATO 2030 report. Now, this means that for the Western Balkans, it's like a new chapter of its relationship with NATO. The relationship for about a quarter of a century, it has been very much what can NATO do for the Western Balkans. That began with the military missions. I4 for K4, which is still in service. But it also led to, we have now 5 Western Balkans, counting Slovenia, 5 Western Balkan countries that are full NATO members. And that is certainly not a minor achievement. In some respect, and you get a sense about it in the NATO communiqué, is mission almost accomplished. The Western Balkan, or countries of the Western Balkan, are mentioned in only 4 paragraphs of the 70+ NATO communiqué. Sure enough, the Western Balkans are called a region of strategic relevance for NATO, and obviously they will remain so, especially in a time of geopolitical competition. But let's face it, from the Western Balkan point of view, they are not central or to the NATO agenda as they've been for a long time or in the past. And this is basically the price of success. Obviously, not all the Western Balkans are NATO members. The relationship, the partnership with Serbia is mentioned as a positive step, guarantees to Kosovo through K4, and the door open to Bosnia-Herzegovina. But the point now is that, like Ben Haddad said, that the NATO has become part of a sort of relaunching of the transatlantic relationship, with an administration that has categorically reconfirmed its commitment to NATO, but also expect the European side of the Atlantic to take its share of responsibility toward NATO goals. The NATO that is emerging from the communiqué, as it did from the NATO 2030 report, seems to have 3 main features, in my view. European security, which is a 360-degree security, so it's not certainly east deterrence of Russia, but it's also the south and the Mediterranean, remains the core mission of NATO. And I'm pretty sure that that will be reaffirmed in the new strategic concept. 360 degrees include also the north, thinking about the Arctic. At the same time, it is a NATO that becomes less, from a military point of view at least, less expeditionary. I think Ben was right on target when he said it's significant that one of the first decisions by the Biden administration was to confirm in a coordinated way, but to stay the course with regard to withdrawal from Afghanistan. But third, NATO is going politically global. And this is what President Grabar just mentioned that point. So I really think for the Western Balkans, the time has come, even, we're not talking about superpowers, but what the Western Balkans bring in terms of strengthening the cohesion of the Atlantic Alliance, what they bring to the table, what they can do, given we're talking about relatively small countries, but they have a key strategic position, what they can do to increase NATO political cohesion. And so the challenge for the Western Balkans right now, to me, is to play to the end the card of the, now we're fully member of the club, we've made our grade, and we want to fully give our contribution to NATO. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. And since you mentioned Western Balkan a couple of times, I think it's a perfect opportunity and a very good introduction for Mr. Krivokapić, who's coming actually from Montenegro. And please, Ranko, the floor is yours. First introductory remarks, a few minutes, and then, maybe to follow up on this, what Stefano just said regarding the Balkans, the Western Balkans, and then we will continue in that respect, but on which card the Western Balkan will play, especially, having in mind the development of situation in Montenegro, in Serbia, in the whole region, basically, with this or that way, So please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Best regards to all of you, and I'll try to follow based on Stefano in the nurture note, not to give mine. Balkans has practically the same role like after division of the Roman Empire. Nothing changed in the few thousand years. We are still the South Belly, one period of Ottoman Empire, now of the NATO and EU. Strategically, it's the same position like Crimea for the Russians in the 19th century. That's the reason for the famous Crimean War between 1853 and 1856. But we are still now the South Belly, and I believe probably not on the NATO Summit. Is not put on the special stress, but I believe generally in behavior of the new administration, President Biden, it's probably more important that his sentence on the press conference, quite frankly, that America is back. On the Balkans, that sentence is much more stronger than I believe in the rest of the regions inside in the Europe. Let's see. His executive order from June 8th, enhancing practically the order about corruption, crime, undermining security interests of the United States on the region. If you know that the region is the regional autocracies, Western Balkans, and those relations between autocracies and political elites is always natural. If you would like to get democracy, you are going on the West. If you like to keep power, you are going on the East. And that's natural area for influence of the China and Russia. And I truly believe that in the last 4 years, Russia is much more and China is much more in the Balkans than before. Not only in the Balkans, I believe much more present in the region, in the Europe, in many elements. And probably we are always obsessed that the Balkans is so important, but we paid a lot for that, sometimes underestimating the position of the Balkans. If I can feel well, position Montenegro, after many contacts with all those representatives from the East, I believe that President Biden fully understood what's going on in the Balkans, and it's very important to start to clean this area from real autocracies. They are destroying all achievements probably for the Obama administrations and before. And now Balkans will be, I believe, probably not in the communique, but just one paragraph, but in real political activities in the Balkans, like Stefano mentioned, on Europe, like Stefano mentioned, I believe the Balkans will be very, very strong laboratory of those type of the close contacts between Europe, NATO, and China and Russia. Thanks.
Thank you, Ranko. I think now after we have the full overview, maybe just to stick a few more minutes, Kolinda, if you agree on the Western Balkans, of course, you are our neighboring here, so. My question, to you, after listening to all this, may these intra-European rifts jeopardize a common transatlantic agenda? Or to go, more to reflect this to here, can it actually transfer these risks? Can they be transferred to some other arena and influence, for example, the Western Balkans? Please.
Yes, we have seen disagreements between the two sides of the Atlantic, or at least a different range of opinion that I mentioned, where threats that were coming from inside that were internal to the alliance. And those disagreements range from previously looking at NATO as a system of liberal democracies, the sole definition of NATO and what it does, what it should be doing in our societies, to some very specific concerns. Ben mentioned that one of the challenges for the future certainly will be investment and into defense. I don't like to call it defense spending, because I think it's investment and it's an insurance policy for the future. So we all have to step up. I think that as of next year, about 10 NATO member countries will have reached, according to their planning, the 2% threshold. But increasingly, what we have been speaking about is, has that focus solely on numbers really hurt not just the transatlantic cohesion, but has it sort of derailed us from what is really at stake, and that is keeping that cohesion and capabilities together? What we can expect in the future is divisions on China. I recently came from the US, and the sentiments in the US with respect to China are much greater in terms of perceiving China as a threat, both as an economic and as a security threat, than they are in Europe. And I think that the language of the communique, which you said was a little bit ambiguous, reflects that disagreement in opinion. Which states that it is perceived as a strategic actor and a threat, but there is need to continue communication and dialogue with China on a set of issues. The perception towards Russia is perhaps a bit similar, just perhaps because Russia is so much closer in terms of geographic terms and the perception of threat. But I do believe that several European countries will never be in complete agreement with the United States in terms of perception, balancing their strategic interests of economic cooperation, energy cooperation, etc., with their obligations within the alliance. Can that translate to the Western Balkans? I think less likely than it was before. The previous administration did not really have much of an interest in the Western Balkans, and they did not know the Western Balkans that well. With President Biden, it's much different because he has a personal interest, and I would dare say an affection for this region because of the turbulence and the suffering of people of the recent past, and his strong belief in democracy, liberal democracies, and NATO and the European Union as a vehicle in promoting democracy, market economy, liberal social order, etc. So what do we see in the Western Balkans in terms of perceptions towards democracy on the one hand, and in terms of perceptions towards China and towards Russia? So if you look at polling that has been done in Central and European and Eastern European countries and in the Western Balkans, you will see that definitely majority of populations in all the countries support and think that democratic systems are the way forward for their country. However, there is a majority, a little bit less than the one who supports democracy, who does not trust the democratic systems in their own countries. So there is this distrust towards institutions, which can be corrosive and which can represent a potential vulnerability. About 1/3 of the population would even support some kind of a semi-autocratic regime if they could put things in order. Now, looking in those terms towards China and Russia, the perceptions definitely in Central Europe towards China is, I would say, neutral. China is not perceived as a threat, nor a big friend. It's perceived as a country of interest who has done, I think, a few really good steps in terms of soft power and public diplomacy by coming up with programs such as China Plus 17 or 16 now, One Belt, One Road initiative, and others that sort of fill the vacuum of lack of investment. Somebody mentioned investment, but definitely geoeconomics and investment will become a strategic tool, not just a process of making money for your companies or for your countries. Investment will be also key to stabilization and controlling entire countries or region. In terms of Russia, there is a relatively favorable perception, and a majority of people actually in the Western Balkans, apart from Croatia and Slovenia, I would say, perceive Russia as sort of a victim of the Western rhetoric and the expansion of NATO, which people understand to be perceived by Russians as a threat to their security, no matter all the assurances that we have given from NATO that NATO enlargement is not directed against Russia. And the partnership with Russia, which is currently, even what the communique says, not business as usual, it's mostly crisis communication in order to prevent incidents from happening. However, this sympathy towards Russia does not actually translate into geopolitical gains for Russia in that sense. The majority of the population in Western Balkans still perceive European integration and NATO as the way that they want to go. So there is actually a relatively small percentage who see the future in their association with Russia, closer association with Russia. We know Serbia most notably so. It's a part of the official agenda, trying to balance between the EU and Russia. And Montenegro, perhaps to a bit of a lesser degree, but there is still strong support for strong Russian sentiments, although again, the majority want to continue to stay members of the NATO alliance and see their future elsewhere from that. And what is also very important is the perception of leaders. With the former administration, the Russian president was perceived more favorably in our region, but with President Biden, those perceptions have changed. I would say that those are also huge expectations of him and of his presidency that he will have to live up to, considering how many problems the current administration is now facing on the domestic front with respect to ending the pandemic, economic recovery, and the future of the transatlantic relationship, where NATO will not be, they will continue to insist on investment. But I don't think that the EU countries will oppose that much. Where I see, the potential for disagreement is economic interests and the trade partnership. Because I don't think that President Biden will be in a position, considering his domestic constituency, to go to a complete restitution of some of the privileges or some of the arrangements that existed between the European Union and the United States in terms of trade, and let alone go back to any negotiations on the transatlantic trade and investment partnership.
Thank you, Kolinda. Since we are already talking about Russia, during the Biden-Putin meeting, the US president challenged Putin for a more constructive agenda for relations based on mutual interests. What are the certain red lines of Biden's administration which might bring devastating consequences in case Russia crosses them? Just, and also, it's related not only with the Western Balkans, but all around the world, with the situation all around. So can you elaborate that a little bit, please?
Yeah, absolutely. It was an interesting decision from President Biden to decide to meet with Vladimir Putin so early in his term. Some people criticized it beforehand, were a little skeptical about what could be achieved. And I think what President Biden wanted to do was, to your point, make the relationship more constructive, or at least make it more predictable. That's a term that's been used a lot. Try to stabilize and deconflict the relationship. I don't think this administration expects a lot from its relationship with Russia and with Vladimir Putin. A lot of them were already in the Obama administration during the Russian aggression against Ukraine, 2014, 2015, and of course, they have been the victims of the 2016 Russian interference into the U.S. presidential election, hacking of the emails of the DNC. So, I don't think there's a lot of appetite from the Biden administration to re-engage Russia with sort of a new reset or anything of the sort. And clearly, that's not the agenda here. That's not the case. With that being said, clearly, you can't ignore Russia. You need to have the best constructive dialogue you can have. Even during the Cold War, there was recurrent dialogues with Soviet leaders. Here, there's a desire to try to work on arms control agreements, especially, and I think that was one of the key areas of priorities. But also to try to clearly, as you said, address red lines, and especially on some of the areas that are not regulated yet. One of the key ones is cyber attacks, and we've seen this addressed in the conversation between President Biden and President Putin, where Biden laid out, what he called 16 key critical infrastructure, which were red lines for cyber attacks. Now, of course, all of Russian cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure and territory are beyond the pale. But in those ones, I think it clearly means that they would be considered either as acts of war, or at least would lead to disproportionate retaliation from the United States. So hospitals and places like this. So I think it is important to convey those messages, to have this conversation. One key question for me, and we've seen what happened just a few days ago with the European Council rejecting the French and German proposal to have a new EU summit with Russia. It is clearly what role Europe can play in this relationship. We talked about this already. The priority for the United States will be the strategic competition with China, and I completely agree with what Kolinda just said. If you look at the just shift of mood in Washington over the last few years, there's really no one left to believe in a sort of a positive, a constructive relationship with China. Now, the narrative of strategic competition has become completely bipartisan in the United States, Democrats and Republicans. You can have difference in methods in how Democrats and Republicans would address that, but clearly there's a sense that President Xi Jinping has embarked his nation on a much more aggressive and assertive foreign policy, that the regime is becoming increasingly authoritarian, and that a genocide is taking place in Xinjiang. So that's something now that has become, kind of a consensus in the United States. So all the hopes that we saw in the 90s and 2000s for what we called convergence, the idea that the Chinese political system would open and moderate with the economic opening. Basically, the opposite has happened. The regime has become more closed and more authoritarian in the last decade. So the priority will be on China. So this pushes Europeans to have to think about the kind of relationship that they want to have with Russia, and how to lead to maybe a more constructive kind of relation. Is that possible with the current leadership in Russia? I think a lot of us are very skeptical that there's even interest in Russia for that. President Macron, for example, in the last few years tried to open a new dialogue with Putin, invited him over, went to Russia with so far very little results. I think there's a sense in Russia that a confrontational approach to the West is in Russia's interest. It's a way to maybe elevate Russia on the world stage. And so I don't see right now a lot of interest for this. I mean, we saw also more recently the failed visit of High Representative Borrell, who was sort of trapped in this press conference with Lavrov the same day that European diplomats were expelled from Russia. So I think going at it the way the Biden administration did, which is with low expectations, to set red lines, a more constructive and predictable relations, try to work on what we can work on, especially arms control, but also do it from a position of strength. And I think what Biden did in terms of imaging was actually really quite successful, because having that summit just after G7, NATO, EU, where you clearly had a positive images of the transatlantic relationship, a rekindling of U.S. leadership with allies, I think that conveyed, a strong message of Western unity. You can do it with this, but not expect too much, I think, from this relationship at this stage.
I always have a problem with this mute, unmute, so I get lost. Don't mind, please. Thank you, Ben. I can't agree more with you, about this, especially as you said, in these circumstances, and until, we have such a power in Russia, and we will come back to Russia, but before doing that, Kolinda mentioned China, and the relations, and for the first time, talking about China so openly, but Stefan, my question to you goes, is actually related to what does the lack of that specific challenges posed by China to NATO infrastructure says about uneasy consensus among allies when we are actually talking about them,
Well, this listening to before to what was said before about the lack of consensus between Americans and Europeans on China, by Kolinda, I do not disagree with her, but it's also very much matter of glass half full and half empty. I mean, if you look at the NATO communique, but also the G7, the Europeans went quite far in recognizing the Chinese challenge. If you put yourself in American shoes and Biden administration shoes, they can be quite satisfied, at least in declaratory terms, how far Europeans have gone at this point in time. You know, if you compare with a year ago, or even with the fact that just in December, the comprehensive agreement on investment was signed in a rush, and now it's sort of certainly faces big hurdles, ratification faces hurdles in the European Parliament. So there is the difference, I think, with respect to China. The big difference between Europeans and America is that we in Europe don't feel the challenge as a global challenge for world supremacy. Possibly because we're not the world superpower, so you can't be challenged in something that you don't have. But we start recognizing the downside of the invasiveness of Chinese economic power. We're all sort of, certainly Italy, taking a step back from supporting the Belt and Road Initiative. The EU is putting a strong screening on foreign investment, which will apply to all third countries, sure. But if you read the text, which I did, the text of the Commission proposal, China is mentioned. So there is an awareness. How far can we go? Time will tell. Depends also what the US will be able to put on the market. Obviously, you know, the trade agenda has got an important truce on the Boeing Airbus dispute. You know, a 5-year suspension of those tariffs is not considered. It is a 17-year-old war. Is not irrelevant. Obviously, there's still the other tariffs, the steel and aluminum. I mean, there are a number of issues. There will be issues with carbon tax. There's certainly a lot of ironing to do in the different approach to the global corporate global minimum tax against the digital tax that a number of countries, including Italy, are already applying. But I think we certainly made a progress, at least toward recognizing that we have to discuss China in a sort of transatlantic setting. And if we talk about transatlantic setting, there are only two real fora. One is NATO, and the other is a EU-US bilateral consultation, which leaves out the UK. So in a way, unless we find a way to reassociate somehow to this consultation, UK, NATO as an edge. And this is why it is so important, the stress which is being put on political NATO. Let me also say, if I can add a little bit, I thought it was very interesting what Kolinda said about the perception, the public opinion in the Balkans regarding Russia, regarding China. You know, this is not so new to an Italian, because in Italy, public opinion was deeply divided about NATO all throughout the Cold War. We had a divide, we have an iron curtain running across Italy. The important thing was that we kept the course, two different governments, and that's what the Western Balkans must be able to do. If I can put it bluntly, it is up to the people of the Western Balkans to decide whether they feel that they are the easternmost part of Europe or the southern part of Russia. It's an identity choice, but that it's only the people themselves in democracies that can do it.
I'm pretty much sure about that, Stefan, but the situation in the field, is quite different, I guess, especially looking into the Balkans region, and Ranko, talking about Russia, talking about all these actually developments in the latest period of time. Ben mentioned, as one of the biggest challenges, cyber attacks, but we didn't talk about malign influence. And we are actually witnesses here in Montenegro what happened in 2016. We actually witnessed, Russian meddling in elections in 2016. We thought, or we at least hoped that after Montenegro membership into NATO 2017, that meddling or that influence will be a little bit less. On the contrary, they rise their influence not only in Montenegro, but in the whole region, So how NATO NATO and the allies can help us by fighting that malign influence, coming not only from Russia, but primarily from Russia today, tomorrow maybe from China or some other countries, what can we done together in order to fight with that, and what can be done, to really build a democracy here, because I think people are confused right now, with everything, at least based on that, what I heard on a daily basis, what is happening in Montenegro. Everybody's asking me that, People are confused because they don't see in which direction, Montenegro is really going, from the country which was a leader in EU, in the region, toward the EU, we become a country, who is questioning, are we going to send Ben was talking, Stephanie was talking about and mentioned KFOR mission, we are actually today questioning, shall we send our soldiers to KFOR mission, to some other missions, where we are actually today. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we are not objective. We are on the ground, almost in the battle.
Try to be as objective as you can.
I'll try.
And I'm sure.
I'll try.
And please, this is also for all of you, for other, to jump into this discussion, because I think it's really important now, to see in which direction the Balkan should go, how US and Europe should position themselves into this region in order to find the proper way out from the situation where we are right now. Ranko, sorry for interrupting you. Please, the floor is yours.
When you have an empire like Russia, and long-lasting empire, one region like on the Balkans, it's not so hard to find pattern in their behavior. Due to Russia is more or less empire, the different names in the last few centuries, and on the Balkans, they didn't change a lot. They always connected and use Orthodox line, like permanent line, and now in last time after Berlin Wall, they started to use the economic influence, intelligence influence. Normally, one article from beginning of 19th, Oleg Deripaska, tycoon of New Russia, wrote that our investments on the Balkans are our new red art. And just to check a few elements, Croatia, like stable, not orthodox country like Montenegro, and few companies like MOL, like Agrokor, New Agrokor, has dominant Russian investments. Compare with Montenegro. they have direct line Serbian church, like more devoted to the Russian church than own state, if you ask me, for the Serbian church. Because sometimes they not agree with the Serbian government, like the Đinđić, even in one period of date agreement with Milošević, and those lines are historical. Deep, they are not accounting time in mandate, they are not accounting time in decades, they are accounting time in the century, try to establish, deploy all those lines. Montenegro is perfect for that. You know, only one country, Mediterranean coast, is dominantly Orthodox and Slavic. No one the other. Greece is dominantly Orthodox but not Slavic. Croatia is dominantly Slavic but not Orthodox. And they're using those historical lines, the prejudice, those lack of enlightenment about civic society, etc., etc. Montenegro is now under this type of attack. And okay, Montenegro is not decisive for all situations, but could be some kind of the bad message. If one model of the interference in the elections, in political life, in the government, and control the government, could be very, very encouraging for the next steps. If you know that we are area of the unfinished peace, let's say, unfinished peace, let's use that word. And with those structures, the same structures like during the war, look at who is on the top of the Serbia, not somebody for the anti-war movement from the 90s. Who is now on the position Montenegro, same second name, but quite different political stage. Yeah, for the same clan as you, Montenegrin, especially, but two opposite sides of political opinion. And Montenegro was, and I'll finish on that thesis. Montenegro was the, let's say, some way of the anchor of stability of the Western Balkans. Now we are becoming more and more, not battlefield, but field of the many disturbances, field of the many challenges. Some way of Casablanca, I use the word, of many activities, like field for those type of instability. And using all our experiences, believe me, in the last 30 years and before, I believe Montenegro has to be the focus how those type of partners are functioning on the Balkans.
Guys, do you have something to add on this? Kolinda, you maybe, since you know the situation very well, on this, what Ranko was talking about. What's your perception from Croatia? I mean, you visited in the official capacity Montenegro a number of times, you know, but what's your perception today, you know?
And, you know, personally, I was always supported Montenegro's accession to NATO and to the European Union. First and foremost, it was your choice, the choice of your people, the strategic direction that you wanted to go. And I argued, you know, very hard within NATO, both in my capacity as president and as part of this senior civilian leadership of NATO for the enlargement of NATO to Montenegro, but also to other countries now. Fortunately, Northern Macedonia has also been, I won't say rewarded, but has really reached the goal that rightfully belonged to them as they solved a very, very difficult national issue. And that all reflects upon the sentiments of people. You know, that people in the region, they're proud. They want to be accepted as equal. They want to pay their share, but they want to get their money's worth back as well. So in the context of Montenegro, when I worked for NATO, I also engaged those who were NATO skeptic and actually had roundtables with them. I listened to their opinion. And actually, I am quite optimistic, to end on an optimistic note, in spite of the current turbulences, and we're all going through the same process. I said that on the one hand, people in the whole neighborhood firmly believe that the full democracy is the way forward, but on the other hand, they don't trust their own systems, including in Croatia. You see a lot of skepticism. The pandemic has contributed to that because we've all become sort of more self-absorbed. We turned in as individuals, but as nations as well. We've seen the rise of COVID nationalism, vaccine nationalism, unequal distribution, etc. So it all does affect public opinion. But as long as people believe in democracy and want to go that way, and they're not looking for alternatives, and currently they're not in the Western Balkans, then we are on the right path. But Brussels and Washington, by Brussels, I mean the whole of NATO, all of the capitals, and North America, Washington, DC, and Ottawa must realize that what happens in this part of NATO or in this part of Europe very much affects the stability of the entire continent. So it's always better to keep an engaged dialogue than to give rise to suspicion. And ultimately, one of the disadvantages that we have, that you mentioned, misinformation, election interference, etc. It's going to be very difficult to deal with that because we will see a lot more of that. Trolling, fake news, really confusing the public. And out of principle, we don't engage. So all we can do is damage control and try to serve the right type of information. But out of principle, we do not engage in psyops, in info ops, and black ops. So we will not be doing the same things that people who are trying to undermine our societies or our values are doing. And you know, they say that when you fight a war on the ground, it's best to use equal or superior weaponry. Well, you know, whether people will be able to recognize the truth in all of this that is said in the information environment very much depends on the responsibility of everyone. And I would particularly underline the responsibility of the media, which should really stop being tabloid and engage in serious discussions, having public interest in mind.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, you know, and we at the Atlantic Council, we have a digital forensic center who discovered thousands, I would dare to say, you know, of examples of disinformation and the fake news in the past 3 years, coming mostly, you know, from Russia directly through some media outlets from Serbia or from some other countries, but our media outlets which are directly related, you know, to Russia, you know. So just to conclude, you know, is there any common recipe how to fight this malign influence? No, I'm not talking only, you know, about the cyber attacks. I'm talking here about disinfo. I'm talking about fake news. I'm talking about meddling into elections. You know, is there something in common what all countries, what all allies can do, you know, in order to prevent such a malign influence? That would be the last question for today for all of you. Thank you. So who's going to talk first? Ben, maybe you? You've been quiet for some time.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, there's no silver bullet response, but I find it very useful that we're focusing more and more on resilience. This is one of the key words that we heard also out of the NATO summit. You know, and resilience means a lot of things. I mean, it does mean investing in our critical infrastructure and having the ability to defend them. It means also recognizing that, you know, these attacks don't come out of nowhere, right? I mean, they can come out of non-state actors, but very often they're sponsored by countries like Russia. And so drawing the red lines, having the capacity to retaliate, making clear that we will respond, that's also part of an effective deterrence policy. And one other thing, I mean, you know, some of it is, we talked about cyber attacks, some of it is malign influence through social media or hacking or corruption. So the resilience also means straightening our democracies and making sure that they deliver for our citizens. You know, I mean, I've seen in recent years, sometimes there's been a tendency to attribute votes that didn't go the way we expected them to external influence. Let's take the Brexit example. And sometimes we made a little too much out of external influence. I mean, we also have to hear what voters are saying, hear some of the anger, some of the message on inequalities, on the fact that the system is not delivering for voters anymore. So I think it's also important, and this is what we're hearing from this administration, to invest in the economic response, to invest in fighting inequalities or defending our infrastructure. So it's really this multi-pronged effort, I think, that will be really necessary.
Thank you. Stefano?
I think if I were, like you are, a Montenegrin Atlanticist, you probably must have feel like an enormous relief when Montenegro became a NATO member. It's over, it's done. Unfortunately, it is never over. So the battle for hearts and minds of the public opinion continue. I think that in this particular case, the catch would be to try to shift the emphasis from the past to the future. Sure, we all know the historical bonds existing between Montenegro and Russia, the strength of the Orthodox Church, or the language, so you name it. But you can't, no country should just become hostage of its past. This has been very much a problem in the Western Balkans. The past is continuously raised. I mean, you go to Belgrade and they show you the bombing, the NATO bombing. Now, it's about a quarter of a century since that war. So, if you'd gone to Berlin, Berlin was West Berlin, or anywhere in Germany, 25 years after the Second World War, no one would have shown you the bombing by the Allies. Germany was a fully integrated, West Germany at the time, NATO country, founding member of the then European Economic Community. So, and if you're able to sort of direct the attention of the people, of your people, to what they want to be, not what they've been, then I think what Western Europe, what the Atlantic has to offer, both in terms of values and also, frankly speaking, in terms of living conditions, that's the freedom of COVID permitting in having a good life, still wins the day. The reason I'm saying this because we, again, in countries like Italy, France, Spain, etc., we did go to that kind of fight for hearts and minds during the Cold War. We had very strong communist parties. But was something I can tell you, this one went to the university in the late 60s. Even sort of hardcore communists, in terms of lifestyle, they never wanted what the Soviet Union was offering at the time. So that's really like a former Hungarian ambassador in Washington once gave a really enlightening conference. The title was "How the Rock and Roll Rocked the Soviet Union." And I think that kind of attraction that the West, in terms of culture and values, offers is still our trump card.
Thank you, Stefano. Ranko, please, shortly, your concluding remarks.
I cannot add something better, but always use one simple sentence: democracy is the best defense of Montenegro, and that's the way how we can change those type of the situation. The reason why we are here, because we had a lack of democracy, and that space entered the other players. But if we really, what Stefano and the others mentioned, are capable to develop democracy, we have the very, very effective defense in the future.
Thank you so much, Ranko. Kolinda, as always, an optimist, and we need a very optimistic, message at the end. So please, in your style.
Yes, I will do so. Well, first, the political elites have to stop looking for problems elsewhere and really look at ourselves and see what it is that we're doing wrong, why people are losing confidence in institutions and in politicians. And secondly, information. Speaking about a little laugh, perhaps, one of the most uncomfortable situations that I had in my career was actually in Montenegro, when we were opening the NATO Information Center. I think that was, in my relatively long career as a politician, as a diplomat, that was the only situation when somebody actually wanted to throw eggs and tomatoes at me. And it was very difficult to speak against the booing and the whistling of the audience and the loud music. But, look at it today. And why? Because information is actually what destroys. Everybody has the right to their opinion, but information, that the truth is there. And several years later, Montenegro is a member state of NATO. Due to your persistence, the strategic direction that you're not just the political elites, but the people have chosen. So we need to continue working, all of us, in the Western Balkans, and not reopen some of the old issues, but really continue working together to see how we can assist each other in stabilizing our democracy.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad that you actually mentioned that situation in Montenegro. I remember it very well,
I love Montenegro. I didn't take it against you in any way. So.
I know. You proved to be a real friend, a good friend of Montenegro, even after that, but guys, before concluding, I just want to thank you so much for being with us. I know it's not easy, to find some time, especially late afternoon. For Ben, for you, it's much easier, because it's early morning in the DC, but for us, not only in Montenegro, but I think in the whole region, there is only one choice, and that's the West, to belong to the West, not because of NATO, not because of EU, but because of the values. And we will continue, or at least we should continue, fighting for that, by the most powerful weapon, I think, which we actually possess. That's the truth. Always telling the truth and nothing but the truth. So, guys, once again, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joined us for this session.
Sorry.
Please.
We had to support Croatian football team today.
Yes.
Without Perisic, but with us.
Thank you.
All the best. All the best.
Thank you, Ranko. It's good that we have at least somebody, who's watching, because I'm totally out of that. So don't mind me, Kolinda, for that. But that we are always cheering for you, thank you once again, and we'll be in touch, and looking forward to see all of you, you know, in Budva in October 14 to 16 of October during our To Be Secure Forum. And not to forget, maybe something the most important, which I should mention at the beginning, you know, that we managed to organize this event and all other events like this in the future, which we are actually planning to organize, thanks to the Balkan Trust for Democracy as a part of the German Marshall Fund and the USAID. Thank you guys, and looking forward to seeing you again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.